The mercenary cruiser Gravewind drifted through the outer defense perimeter of the Celestial Court, its scarred hull reflecting the pale glow of the station's rings. Around it moved vessels of impossible elegance, diplomatic yachts shaped like silver petals, trade barges surrounded by shimmering energy veils, patrol craft that slid through space as silently as hunting birds. The Gravewind looked like a rusted tool tossed into a jewelry case. Inside the cockpit, Drake Ashton leaned back in his chair, boots resting against a console that had long ago stopped displaying anything useful. The navigation system beeped irritably, as if offended by his presence. "Relax," Drake muttered, tapping the panel. "You're still flying, aren't you? That's more than most ships your age can say." The console beeped again, louder this time. "Right, fair point," he admitted. "You're younger than me." A docking vector appeared on the forward display, transmitted from the palace traffic control. The message was polite, precise, and written in 6 languages, all of which essentially meant, "Please try not to crash into anything expensive." Drake guided the cruiser forward, watching the celestial court grow larger in the viewport. It wasn't a palace in the traditional sense. It was a cluster of immense structures suspended within a transparent sphere, each tower linked by luminous bridges and drifting platforms covered in gardens. Streams of tiny shuttlecraft moved between them like glowing insects. He had seen many stations in his life: mining platforms carved into asteroids, military citadels bristling with cannons, refugee habitats patched together from scrap. But nothing like this. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost unreal, as if the place existed not for survival, but simply because someone had decided the universe should contain something beautiful. Drake frowned slightly at that thought. Beauty was expensive. Expensive things were usually guarded by people who disliked mercenaries. The docking clamps engaged with a heavy metallic thud. A moment later, the airlock indicator turned green. Drake stood, adjusting the collar of his worn coat. The fabric was reinforced with fiber armor, though it hardly looked impressive. That suited him fine. People who underestimated him tended to make mistakes, and mistakes tended to keep him employed. The airlock opened with a soft hiss, and a delegation waited on the other side. 3 officials in flowing uniforms and a hovering drone projecting a faint blue halo of scanning light. The tallest official stepped forward. "Captain Drake Ashton," the man said, inclining his head. "Welcome to the Celestial Court." Drake glanced at the drone as it passed over him, humming quietly. "If that thing starts charging me docking fees by the kilogram," he said, "I'm walking back to my ship." The officials exchanged uncertain looks, clearly unsure whether he was joking. "I'm joking," Drake added. "Mostly." They escorted him through corridors lined with translucent walls, beyond which drifted gardens filled with luminous plants. Small creatures flitted between the branches, winged shapes that shimmered like living prisms. Drake paused for a moment, watching one of them dart past. "Are those edible?" he asked. One of the officials blinked. "They are. Not intended to be." "Shame," Drake said. "They look like they'd taste expensive." The corridors opened into a vast hall where gravity shifted subtly with each step, guiding visitors toward the central chamber. Delegates from dozens of worlds moved through the space, tall beings with crystalline skin, compact figures in exosuits, and others so alien Drake couldn't immediately tell which direction they were facing. He felt eyes on him as he walked. Mercenaries were not common guests here, not welcome ones in many cases. Good, he thought. Let them stare. At the far end of the hall stood doors that rose nearly 20 meters high, their surfaces etched with patterns that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of the eye. The officials stopped there. "You will be announced," one of them said. Drake nodded, folding his arms loosely. He waited, listening to the faint hum of distant machinery and the softer sound of wind moving through the artificial gardens somewhere above. For a moment, he felt an odd sensation, something like familiarity, though he couldn't say why. He dismissed it. Places like this had nothing in common with the worlds he had known as a child. The doors began to open. The throne chamber beyond was immense, its ceiling lost in pale light. At its center rose a dais of white stone, and upon it stood the throne of the celestial court. Queen Elys'andra sat there, her posture composed, her expression calm. Is this safe to eat? Or is it one of those ceremonial dishes where I'm supposed to admire it and pretend I'm not hungry? The attendant blinked. It is quite safe, Captain. Good, Drake said, taking a bite. He chewed thoughtfully, then nodded. Not bad. Tastes like something that had a good life before it became dinner. The attendant hesitated, then allowed himself a small smile. Most of our livestock are raised in low-gravity pastures, he said. They are quite content. Low-gravity pastures, Drake repeated. That explains it. Happy animals taste better. I should remember that next time I'm eating something that tried to kill me. The attendant chuckled softly, then seemed to remember himself and straightened. If you require anything else, Captain, you need only ask. After he left, Drake finished the meal and returned to the window. The artificial night cycle of the station had begun, and the gardens below were illuminated by thousands of tiny lights drifting like fireflies. He leaned his forehead against the glass, watching them, and suddenly, without warning, a memory stirred. Faint, fragmented, like a signal breaking through static. A dark sky, not the clean darkness of space, but the heavy dust-filled night of a frontier world. The smell of dry wind and rusted metal. The sound of someone laughing softly at a joke that wasn't very funny. Drake frowned, trying to grasp the memory, but it slipped away, leaving only a vague unease. He pushed himself away from the window. Get a grip, he muttered. You're here to negotiate a contract, not wander down memory lanes that probably lead nowhere. Still, as he lay down on the unfamiliar softness of the bed, he found himself staring at the ceiling long after the lights dimmed. Across the station, in a chamber far removed from the guest quarters, Queen Elys'andra stood alone on a balcony overlooking the stars. The vastness beyond the transparent barrier stretched endlessly, scattered with distant suns and the faint glimmer of passing ships. She held a small object in her hand, a worn, smooth piece of metal no larger than a coin. Its edges were scratched, its surface dull, but she had kept it for 20 years, a scavenger's token given to her by a boy who had insisted it was lucky. You'll need luck, he had said, grinning despite the hunger in his eyes. Out here, luck is better than money. Money gets stolen. She closed her fingers around the token, her throat tightening slightly. Drake Ashton, she whispered to the empty chamber. The name still felt unreal. She had imagined this moment so many times over the years, but never like this. Never with him standing before her, alive and yet so changed that she could barely see the boy she remembered. A soft voice spoke from the shadows behind her. You are troubled, Your Majesty. Her chief advisor stepped forward, his long ears marking him as one of her own people, though age had silvered his hair. Elys'andra composed herself. I am considering the negotiations. The advisor studied her quietly. You have faced far greater matters without such stillness. She allowed herself a faint, weary smile. Even queens are permitted a moment of stillness. He inclined his head, accepting the answer without pressing further. When he had gone, she turned back to the stars, her fingers still wrapped around the small worn token. Far across the station, in a guest chamber overlooking drifting lights, the man who had given it to her slept uneasily, unaware that the past he had forgotten was already beginning to reach for him. Drake woke to the quiet hum of environmental systems and the faint sensation that, for once, nothing was trying to kill him. That alone was unsettling enough to make him sit up immediately. For a moment he didn't move, listening. Years of habit kept his senses alert, even in comfort. The air smelled clean, filtered to a level that felt almost unnatural. No engine vibrations, no distant clatter of machinery, no muffled arguments in neighboring compartments, just silence and the soft glow of the walls responding to his breathing. Too quiet, he muttered, swinging his feet to the floor. Definitely suspicious. A chime sounded, and the wall near the door illuminated with a message. Negotiations will begin in 1 hour. A guide will arrive shortly. Drake rubbed his face and stood, stretching until his shoulders popped. He caught his reflection in the polished surface of a cabinet, dark hair slightly unkempt, faint lines at the corners of his eyes, a narrow scar along his cheek. A man shaped by too many battles and too little rest. Look at you, he said to his reflection, invited to a royal palace. Try not to steal anything on the way out. A moment later, there was a knock. The guide waiting outside was not one of the officials from the previous day, but a compact elderly man in a technician's uniform, carrying a small floating toolkit that hummed softly. "Captain Ashton," the man said cheerfully, "I am here to escort you to the council chamber. Also to ensure you do not accidentally wander into any restricted areas, activate ancient defense systems, or fall into decorative gravity wells." Drake raised an eyebrow. "Those last two happen often?" "More often than you might think," the technician replied. "Diplomats are surprisingly adventurous when bored." They began walking through corridors that shifted subtly in color as they passed. Panels adjusted their transparency, revealing glimpses of the station's inner workings. Vast conduits carrying energy like rivers of light, maintenance drones gliding along tracks, and distant chambers where engineers floated in partial gravity while repairing machinery the size of buildings. Drake glanced at one of the open sections where a group of workers maneuvered a glowing ring nearly 10 meters across. "What's that?" he asked. "A harmonic stabilizer," the technician said. "It keeps the station's gravity field aligned with the rotational matrix." Drake nodded slowly. "I understood at least two of those words." The technician chuckled. "It keeps everything from falling apart." "That part I understood," Drake said. "Important job, then." They passed a balcony overlooking a massive interior space filled with suspended platforms. At its center floated a sphere of liquid metal, slowly rotating, its surface rippling with shifting patterns. Drake stopped, staring at it. "That looks expensive." "It is the court's central quantum archive," the technician said proudly. "Every treaty, every historical record, every navigational chart, stored within." Drake folded his arms. "And here I was keeping my important documents in a dented locker on my ship. I feel underprepared." They continued on, and the technician began pointing out various features of the station with enthusiastic detail, explaining the function of energy relays, atmospheric recyclers, and the self-regulating gardens that produced most of the court's food. At one point, Drake interrupted him. "Do you ever get tired of knowing how everything works?" The technician blinked. "Why would I?" Drake shrugged. "Mystery keeps life interesting." The technician smiled faintly. "Understanding keeps it safe." They reached the entrance to the council chamber, where guards in polished armor stood motionless. The doors opened, and Drake stepped inside. The chamber was smaller than the throne hall, but no less impressive. A circular table occupied the center, its surface displaying a shifting star map. Representatives from several worlds were already seated, their conversations quieting as Drake entered. Queen Elys'andra stood at the far side of the table. For a brief moment, their eyes met again. There it was, that same flicker of recognition, quickly concealed, but impossible to miss once seen. Drake felt a faint unease stir in his chest, like the echo of a forgotten dream. He took his seat, leaning back slightly, one arm resting on the table's edge. "I have to say," he said, glancing at the star map, "this is the nicest negotiation table I've ever seen. Most of mine are crates." A few of the delegates exchanged amused looks. One of them, a tall being with iridescent skin, let out a soft sound that might have been laughter. The negotiations began, moving through terms, security projections, and threat assessments. Drake spoke when necessary, his voice calm, precise, and entirely free of the humor he used so easily in casual conversation. In this setting, he was all focus and calculation, a professional in every sense of the word. Yet even as he spoke, he felt the Queen's gaze on him at intervals. Not intrusive, not hostile, but searching. During a brief recess, Drake stepped away from the table and moved toward one of the chamber's observation windows. Beyond it stretched the stars, sharp and cold. "You handled diplomacy surprisingly well," a voice said behind him. He turned to find Elys'andra standing a few steps away. "I handle survival well," Drake replied. "Diplomacy is just survival with better furniture." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it carried a strange weight, as if something unspoken hovered between them. "You have traveled far," she said at last. "Far enough," Drake answered. "Farther than I expected when I was younger." Her expression softened slightly. The past often shapes us in ways we do not foresee. Drake gave a small, wry smile. That sounds like something a historian would say. Or someone who remembers, she said quietly. He studied her, sensing there was more behind the words. But before he could respond, one of the advisors approached, and the moment passed. As Drake returned to the table, he felt that faint, nagging sensation again. The feeling that he was standing at the edge of something just beyond his understanding. And somewhere deep in his mind, a distant memory stirred once more. The sound of laughter in the dark, the warmth of a small fire, and the faint outline of a girl with long ears sitting across from him, smiling as if, for a little while, the universe was not such a hard place to survive. The negotiations extended into the afternoon, stretching across technical projections, fleet movements, and the delicate politics of border systems that changed hands as often as the tides of a restless sea. Drake found the process familiar in an odd way. War was loud and chaotic, but the decisions that created wars were always made in rooms like this, quiet, polished, and full of careful voices. At one point, a delegate from a crystalline species spent nearly 10 minutes explaining the structural philosophy of defensive satellite arrays, speaking in slow, resonant tones that vibrated faintly in the air. Drake listened for a while, then leaned toward the technician who had escorted him earlier and whispered, "Is he still on the introduction, or are we already at the part where everyone pretends to understand?" The technician coughed, trying unsuccessfully to hide a laugh. When the recess was finally called, Drake stepped out into a corridor that curved along the outer ring of the station. The artificial gravity here was lighter, making each step feel slightly buoyant. Through the transparent wall, a blue-white star burned in silence, its light bending softly along the shielding field. He walked without direction, letting the quiet settle around him. The court was a place built for people who believed in permanence. Every surface was immaculate, every mechanism silent and precise. Nothing here felt temporary. That thought lingered. He had lived his entire life in temporary places, ships patched together from salvage, frontier towns built to be abandoned, battlefields where nothing lasted longer than the next sunrise. He stopped at a small observation platform where a few maintenance drones were quietly polishing the railing with meticulous care. One of them paused, its lens swiveling toward him. "Surface contamination detected," the drone announced politely. "Please remain still." Before Drake could protest, a fine mist sprayed over his boots, dissolving the dust collected from a dozen worlds. He stared down at his suddenly spotless footwear. "Well," he said, "that's the cleanest they've been in 10 years. The drone emitted a soft chime that might have been satisfaction and resumed its work. Drake leaned against the railing, watching the star. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax, to let the tension of constant vigilance loosen just slightly. And then the memory came again. Not as a fragment this time, but as a sensation. The dry, biting wind of a wasteland world. The taste of recycled water from a cracked canteen. The sound of footsteps crunching over sand mixed with metallic debris. He saw a small fire burning low, its light flickering against the twisted remains of an old transport hull. Across from him sat a girl, wrapped in a cloak too thin for the cold, her long ears catching the firelight as she listened to him talk. "You ever notice," he heard his younger self saying, "that people always say the stars are beautiful? Nobody ever says they're cold, or far away, or that if you step out there without a suit, you die in about 5 seconds." The girl had laughed softly. "You are not very poetic." "I'm practical," he replied. "Poetry doesn't keep you warm." The memory faded as suddenly as it had come, leaving Drake staring at the star beyond the glass, his jaw tightening slightly. "Strange," he muttered. "I don't remember that place." A voice behind him spoke. It was a frontier world on the outer rim of the Velaran Reach. Drake turned sharply. Queen Elys'andra stood a few steps away, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. The soft light of the corridor traced the calm lines of her face, but her eyes held something deeper, an intensity that made him feel, for a moment, as though she could see every thought he was trying to hide. "You walk as if you carry many memories," and she said. Drake studied her carefully. "Most people do." "Yes," she agreed, "but most do not try so hard to forget them." He leaned back against the railing, folding his arms. You speak as if you know me. I know what the frontier does to children, she said quietly. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was filled only by the distant hum of the station and the faint vibration of energy flowing through unseen systems. Drake decided, as he often did when conversation edged too close to uncomfortable truths, to deflect. So, he said lightly, gesturing toward the star, do you ever get tired of looking at the same view every day? Elys'andra followed his gaze. The stars are never the same, she said. They move slowly. Entire civilizations rise and vanish between one orbit and the next. Drake considered that. Fair point, though I imagine the paperwork stays the same. That earned the faintest hint of a smile. I would not know, she said. My advisors ensure I am spared the worst of it. Lucky, Drake said. On my ship, I am the advisor, the captain, and occasionally the cook. The crew refuses to let me handle repairs after the incident with the plasma conduit. What incident? She asked. I repaired it, Drake said. Very efficiently. The explosion was relatively small. For a moment, her composure slipped just enough for a quiet laugh to escape. The sound lingered in the air, warm and unexpected, and Drake felt that strange sense of familiarity again, like hearing a melody he almost recognized. You seem different from the stories told about you, she said after a moment. Drake raised an eyebrow. I hope that means I'm less terrifying in person. It means, she said slowly, that the stories do not mention your humor. They usually stop writing before the interesting parts, Drake replied. She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing something unseen. Then she said very softly, do you remember a world called Kareth's Fall? The name struck him like a distant echo. Drake frowned. No, he said honestly. Should I? Elysandra's gaze lingered on him, searching, and for an instant there was something like disappointment in her eyes, quickly hidden, but not entirely. It is an unremarkable place, she said at last. Dust, ruins, and forgotten wars. Sounds like half the planets I've been to, Drake said. Yes, she replied quietly. It does. They stood there a while longer, watching the star burn in silence, and though Drake did not yet understand why, he felt certain that somewhere in the vast distance of his past, a forgotten path was slowly beginning to open. The following day began with a disturbance that spread quietly through the celestial court, like a vibration felt before a distant storm. Drake noticed it first in the way the guards moved, more alert than before, speaking in low voices, their eyes scanning corridors that had seemed perfectly calm only hours earlier. He was finishing breakfast when the same technician who had escorted him the day before hurried into the chamber, his usually cheerful expression replaced by concern. Captain, the man said, lowering his voice, there has been an incident in the lower orbital grid. A relay cluster went offline for approximately 43 seconds. Drake set down his cup. That doesn't sound long enough to worry about. It is long enough, the technician replied, if someone wished to map response times or probe defensive gaps. Drake leaned back, folding his arms. Sabotage? We do not know yet. That usually means yes, Drake said. A summons arrived minutes later, requesting his presence in a restricted section of the station. When he reached the designated chamber, he found Queen Elys'andra already there, standing before a holographic projection of the station's outer defenses. Rings of light marked sensor grids, patrol routes, and shield harmonics. Several advisors spoke at once, their voices overlapping with urgency. No sign of external intrusion. Internal systems accessed through maintenance nodes. Security protocols were bypassed, not broken. Drake studied the projection quietly, then pointed to a small cluster of blinking lights along the outer ring. There, he said. One of the advisors frowned. What about it? That section went offline, Drake said, and patrols were redirected at the same time. Whoever did this wasn't testing defenses. They were testing how long it takes you to notice something small. And why would they do that? Another advisor asked. Drake met his gaze. Because next time, they won't do something small. Silence followed. The Queen turned slightly toward him. What would you recommend? Drake shrugged. Find whoever has access to maintenance corridors and doesn't mind dying if caught. That narrows it down to saboteurs, fanatics, and people with very bad career prospects. One of the advisors stiffened. You speak as if such threats are inevitable. They are, Drake said calmly. In places like this, someone is always unhappy. The investigation began immediately. Drake accompanied a small security team into the maintenance sectors, where the elegant architecture of the court gave way to narrow passageways lined with conduits and humming energy coils. The air here smelled faintly of ozone and heated metal. Drones moved along tracks overhead, their lenses flickering as they scanned for anomalies. One of the guards gestured toward a panel that had been removed from the wall. This is where the access occurred, he said. Drake crouched, examining the edges of the opening. The tool marks were precise, clean, and efficient. Professional, he said, not someone improvising. A faint scraping sound echoed down the corridor. The guards raised their weapons, but Drake held up a hand listening. The sound came again, metal dragging against metal, followed by a muffled curse. They rounded the corner to find a maintenance worker struggling to maneuver a large equipment case through a narrow hatch. The man froze when he saw them, his expression shifting rapidly from annoyance to alarm. I can explain, the worker said quickly. I hope so, Drake replied. Because right now you look like someone who just tried to sneak a reactor core out in a suitcase. It's diagnostic gear, the worker protested. Drake opened the case. Inside was, in fact, diagnostic equipment, along with a compact signal relay and a transmitter tuned to frequencies used by external fleets. The guards moved forward, securing the worker. Well, Drake said, straightening, that answers that. Later, back in the command chamber, the prisoner was interrogated. He spoke quickly, fear loosening his tongue. He had been paid, he said, by intermediaries who never revealed their employers. His task had been simple: test response times, create a temporary blind spot, and transmit the data. For what purpose? One of the advisors demanded. I don't know, the prisoner insisted. I swear it. I was told it was only a test. Drake leaned against the wall, arms folded. Tests are rarely harmless, he said quietly. After the prisoner was taken away, the chamber fell silent. Queen Elys'andra looked at the projection of the station, her expression thoughtful. This is only the beginning, she said. Yes, Drake agreed. Someone out there is preparing for something bigger. She turned to him. You anticipated this quickly. I've seen it before, Drake said. Wars don't start with fleets. They start with small things, missing data, broken relays, people who think no one is watching. For a moment, her gaze lingered on him, and there was something in her expression that was not entirely about the sabotage. You have lived a difficult life, Captain Ashton. Drake gave a faint, crooked smile. I've lived an interesting one. Difficult just makes it sound like I should complain more. That drew a quiet laugh from one of the advisors, easing the tension in the room. But as the meeting ended and the others departed, Drake felt the weight of something unseen pressing closer. Whoever had ordered the sabotage was patient, careful, and willing to wait. And patience, he knew, was the most dangerous weapon of all. Later that evening, he stood again at the observation window, watching distant ships move like slow sparks against the darkness. Somewhere out there, someone was watching the court, measuring it, preparing. Drake exhaled slowly. Well, he murmured to himself, at least it won't be boring. The first alarm sounded just after the station's artificial night cycle began. It wasn't loud, not the kind of blaring siren Drake was used to hearing before explosions and decompression warnings. This alarm was quieter, more controlled, a pulsing tone that seemed designed to alert without creating panic, which, Drake thought as he sat up instantly, usually meant the situation was worse than anyone wanted to admit. A moment later, the wall display activated. Security alert. External interference detected in outer defense grid. Investigation in progress. Drake swung his legs off the bed and began pulling on his coat. Well, he muttered, that didn't take long. By the time he reached the main corridors, guards were already moving in coordinated teams. Overhead, maintenance drones had shifted into surveillance patterns, their lenses glowing brighter as they scanned every movement. The technician from earlier hurried past, nearly colliding with him. Captain, the man said, slightly out of breath, multiple sensor buoys have gone dark. Not destroyed, disabled. Precisely. Blind spots, Drake said. Yes. Drake fell into step beside him. How long? 17 minutes before detection. Drake grimaced. Long enough for someone to move a fleet into position. That is what concerns us. They reached the command chamber, where the atmosphere was tense but controlled. Holographic displays showed the outer regions of the system, sensor coverage flickering where the disabled buoys had been. Queen Elys'andra stood at the center of the room, listening as officers reported in rapid succession. No confirmed hostiles on long-range scans. Signal interference localized but spreading. Defense satellites shifting to active tracking. Drake studied the projection, then pointed to a region near the outer asteroid belt. There, he said. An officer looked at him. What about it? If I wanted to approach this station without being seen, Drake said, that's where I'd hide. Plenty of debris to mask thermal signatures. The officer adjusted the display. For several seconds, nothing appeared. Then a faint anomaly flickered, barely visible, like a shadow moving behind smoke. The room fell silent. Magnify, Elys'andra said. The image expanded, revealing the outline of several vessels, small, angular ships holding position within the debris field. Not a fleet. Not yet. Scouts. They're watching? Drake said quietly. Just like before. Measuring responses. An advisor turned to him. Do you believe they intend to attack? Drake shook his head. Not tonight. If they wanted to strike, they wouldn't announce themselves like this. This is pressure. A message. And what message is that? The advisor asked. That someone out there wants you nervous. A faint ripple of unease moved through the chamber. Elys'andra looked at the projection for a long moment, then gave a calm, measured order. Increase patrol rotations. Do not engage unless fired upon. I want them observed, not provoked. The officers moved quickly to comply. Drake stepped back, folding his arms. You're not reacting the way they expect, he said quietly. She glanced at him. And what do they expect? Panic, Drake said, or aggression. Either one would give them what they want. A faint smile touched her lips. Then we shall disappoint them. Several hours later, Drake found himself once again walking the quieter corridors of the station, unable to sleep. The distant presence of those ships lingered in his thoughts like a storm visible on the horizon. He stopped near a maintenance bay where two drones were engaged in what appeared to be a prolonged argument. Calibration error originates from your adjustment, one drone insisted. My adjustment corrected your misalignment, the other replied. Drake leaned against the doorway, listening for a moment. Gentlemen, he said finally, have you considered that the universe is imperfect and therefore both of you might be wrong? The drones paused, their lenses swiveling toward him. Your statement lacks technical precision, one of them said. Story of my life, Drake replied, pushing off the wall and continuing down the corridor. He eventually reached an observation deck overlooking the outer ring. The stars were sharp and distant, the faint glow of the scout ships barely visible against the darkness. A soft sound behind him made him turn. Elys'andra stood near the entrance, her expression thoughtful. You do not sleep, she said. Not well, Drake replied. Too many years of expecting trouble. She stepped beside him, looking out at the stars. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, she said, do you ever wonder who you might have been if your life had been different? Drake considered the question. Sometimes, he admitted, but wondering doesn't change anything. No, she said quietly. It does not. There was a pause, then she asked, do you remember ever helping someone long ago? Someone who needed protection? Drake frowned slightly. I've helped a lot of people, usually for money. And without payment? He was silent for a moment. I suppose, he said slowly, once or twice, when I was young, before I learned better. Her gaze lingered on him, searching. What made you stop? She asked. Drake gave a faint, tired smile. Reality. The answer seemed to pain her, though she said nothing. They stood there in silence, watching the distant ships drift like dark specks against the stars. After a while, Drake spoke again, his tone lighter. If they're going to spy on us, the least they could do is bring snacks. Watching people all night must make you hungry. To his surprise, she laughed softly. The sound faded and the quiet returned. Far beyond the station, The hidden ships continued to watch, silent and patient. And though neither of them said it aloud, both Drake and Elys'andra knew the same truth. The calm would not last much longer. The attack began at dawn, though dawn in the celestial court was only a programmed transition of light. Drake was already awake when the first warning flashed across the station systems. He felt it before he heard it. A faint vibration through the floor, the subtle shift of power routing as defensive grids activated. He was pulling on his coat when the voice of the station's command network echoed through the corridors. Multiple vessels entering defensive perimeter. Hostile intent confirmed. Drake exhaled slowly. Well, he muttered, there goes breakfast. The command chamber was already alive with movement when he arrived. Holographic projections filled the air, tracking dozens of ships emerging from the asteroid field. Sleek strike craft supported by heavier cruisers that burned forward with deliberate, steady thrust. They waited until our patrols shifted, one officer said. They studied our patterns. Of course they did, Drake replied. That's what the scouts were for. Queen Elys'andra stood at the center of the room, calm but focused, issuing orders with quiet precision. Activate outer defense ring. Deploy interceptors. Do not allow them within firing range of the central structure. The first exchange of fire lit the projection in bursts of light. Defense satellites engaged, beams lancing across space, forcing the attackers to scatter. But the enemy was prepared. Several of their ships released small objects, dark, tumbling shapes that drifted toward the station. Boarding pods, Drake said. A moment later, the impact alarm sounded throughout the outer rings. Security teams moved to intercept, and Drake found himself running with them through corridors that echoed with the distant thud of docking clamps forcing their way through hull plating. They reached the breach point just as the first pod split open. Figures in armored suits surged forward, weapons raised. The firefight was brief and violent. Drake moved with practiced efficiency, his movements precise, controlled. When it was over, the corridor fell silent, except for the hum of damaged systems and the ragged breathing of the guards. One of the younger soldiers stared at Drake. You fight like this every day? Drake wiped a smear of carbon from his sleeve. Only on the days that end in Y. Despite himself, the soldier laughed, tension breaking for a moment. More reports came in, breaches contained, attackers repelled. The enemy fleet, unable to gain ground, began to withdraw under heavy fire from the defense grid. Within an hour, the battle was over. The station stood intact. Later, as engineers worked to repair damaged sections and the court began to settle back into uneasy calm, Drake stood once more at the observation deck, watching the last hostile ships vanish into the darkness. Footsteps approached behind him. Elys'andra stopped beside him, her expression thoughtful, her long ears catching the soft light. It is over, she said. For now, Drake replied. Whoever sent them won't try again soon. They've learned this place isn't easy prey. She studied him quietly. You were instrumental in our defense. I did my job, he said. You did more than that. For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled with the distant glow of stars. Then she reached into her sleeve and drew out a small object, a worn piece of metal, scratched and dulled by time. Drake frowned as she placed it in his hand. The moment his fingers closed around it, the memory came back in full. The fire in the ruins, the cold wind, a frightened girl trying not to show her fear, a boy dividing the last of his food, insisting it was only fair. You dropped this, he had told her, pressing the token into her hand. It's lucky. The stars seemed to spin as the memory settled into place. Drake looked at her slowly. Kareth's fall, he said. Yes, he exhaled, the realization spreading through him like warmth after a long cold. You were the girl, he said quietly. I was, she answered. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Drake shook his head, a faint smile touching his lips. You know, he said, I always wondered what happened to you. Figured you probably became someone important. Elys'andra laughed softly. I suppose I did. He turned the token over in his hand, studying the worn edges. I don't remember much from those days, he admitted. Too many years, too many battles. But I remember that you laughed at my terrible jokes. They were not terrible, she said. They were, he replied. You were just polite. They stood together in silence. the weight of the years between them slowly dissolving. At last she said, "You once helped someone when you had nothing. You believed kindness mattered, even in the harshest places." Drake looked out at the stars. "I forgot that," he said. "Somewhere along the way, I forgot." "But you remembered today," she said. "You chose to help again, not for payment, but because it was right." He considered that, then gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Maybe," he said. "I'm not as lost as I thought." A shuttle passed in the distance, its engines glowing softly as it carried repair crews to the outer rings. Life in the court was already returning to its quiet rhythms. "What will you do now?" Elys'andra asked. Drake slipped the token into his pocket. "I'll finish the contract," he said. "But after that, I don't know. Maybe it's time I started choosing my battles more carefully." She smiled. "The galaxy could use more captains who think that way." He glanced at her. "And queens who remember old debts." They both laughed softly. The stars stretched endlessly before them, silent and bright. And for the first time in many years, Drake felt something he had not expected to feel again. Not the hunger for survival, not the cold readiness for the next fight, but a quiet, steady sense of peace.